The name is Paul Holes, Holes, and I'm a retired Contra Costa County DA cold case investigator.
Recently retired, right?
3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago, okay. I read there were a couple of little profiles that ran in the papers today, and I believe both of them talked about your second to last day on the job as you were about to retire. This case was on your mind. Tell me about that.
Well, yes, I was actively investigating this case up until the day I retired, and as we were sorting through various suspects and D'Angelo started to become a priority, I decided I needed to go up and see where that guy lived. And at that point, he was, there's something promising, but nothing that was anything overwhelming in terms of how he was looking as a suspect. But I left Martinez and I drove up to Citrus Heights, and I literally parked across the street from his house and took in the neighborhood, took in his house. And at that point, I was thinking, what's the likelihood this is actually the guy? And I thought I should probably just go knock on this guy's door, just chat with him a little bit, see if he'd give me a DNA sample and move on, and then we could focus our energies elsewhere. But I thought about it and said, I don't know enough about him. And so that's when I decided I needed to just drive away, and we will research and see if there's anything more that makes him even more promising. And next day, I turn in, the badge, the gun, the car, and as we continued to learn more about him, he became more promising to the point to where we needed to get a direct DNA sample from him. However, even at that point, he was interesting, but nobody could say for sure this is the guy. And it wasn't until the initial DNA testing was done where we got results, and it wasn't the strongest results, but it was strong enough to go, he's the guy, but we need to get another sample. And that's what ended up happening, and we got a second sample, and then Sac Sheriff's Office went ahead and took him into custody.
And so it was going back and getting two discarded?
Two discarded samples, yes.
Okay, all right. So when you think about having been there and not knowing whether this was this person and debating going in and maybe just having conversation with him, what do you think now as we learn more about
initially the thought is it's bittersweet because I wanted to solve the case before I retired, and I drove away. I always thought I'd be able to pick this guy out of a crowd. I knew him so well, right? But I drove away because I just didn't know. But in hindsight, he's a very dangerous individual. We had a lot of guns registered to him. I was alone. It could have been a bad situation. So fortunately, I made the right decision in hindsight.
Absolutely. Good call. Can you talk about, what is the feeling of having a case like this cracked? I can't imagine how fulfilling it must be to finally know this guy is in custody.
It's an amazing feeling, but the reality is it's been go, 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 that I haven't had any chance to kind of sit back and think about it. Right now, the biggest rewards that I have gotten is when I've called the handful of victims that I've had some relationship with, and I've talked with them on the phone, and have heard their reaction, and they're always asking, is it really him? And different people react differently. Some are more steadfast. I've had several who are just sobbing in joy, and some of them are struggling a little bit, to be honest, because it's bringing up the past. But very rewarding to at least hear the relief in their voices, that they can now kind of relax in a way. This guy is behind bars. He's never getting out. And some of these victims had thought, he's going to come back and get me. So they lived in that fear.
Absolutely. There was a detail in there about a woman named Bonnie and how that could have led. Obviously the DNA evidence here, the detective work was very critical here, but that one detail stuck with you. Tell me about that.
Well, that detail is one of those, there's many criteria we look at, but during one of the rape attacks in Davis, he's making the statement, I hate you, Bonnie, while he's sobbing. Yeah, so we always felt that there was a woman named Bonnie in his life that was significant to him, whether it be a mother, whether it be a wife or an ex-girlfriend, something along those lines. And so when we had suspects that had a Bonnie in their past, that would notch them up a little bit, and it kind of caught our attention. However, I've investigated a lot of guys from that era, and a lot of them had women that they had a relationship with who was named Bonnie. So, you start to kind of go, that's not that big of a deal, because there's a much more common name than what I recognize, because when I grew up, I didn't know very many Bonnies at all. But now, in retrospect, that we've identified him and we see that, well, he did have a Bonnie in his past, that becomes interesting. Now, what internally he's thinking about that, I couldn't tell you. It's just absolute speculation at this point in time.
So the Bonnie that was in his life was an ex, is that correct?
It's all we know, and there may be more information that's been discovered now, but all I know at this point in time is that he was engaged to a Bonnie back in 1970. It does not appear that there was a marriage afterwards, so it appears that that relationship broke apart at some point before he marries his next wife.
Some of the feedback that we're hearing, just talking to neighbors, talking to people who knew him, are that this guy was someone who had a really bad temper, and people were at least familiar with having heard him raise his voice, yell, lose his temper. Is that consistent with what you have gathered about this individual over time?
That is absolutely consistent with who the offender is. And quite frankly, that is just new information for me coming in today, so I haven't had a chance to really digest it. However, our offender is somebody who would get angry, and I believe some of the attacks are a result of him getting angry at something in his personal life and needing to direct that anger at the victims in order to be able to satisfy that aspect of him. Of course, there's fantasy aspects with what he's doing, but I always felt he's what I would call an anger retaliatory type of rapist. He's somebody that there's a stressor in his life that makes him angry, and instead of lashing out at what's making him angry, he by proxy lashes out at his victims.
Okay, and that was sort of what was driving him.
I believe that was part of what was driving him. I do think there is an act of fantasy with some of the things that he's doing. There was definitely a sense and need for power. And when you look at what he was when he was doing these attacks, he was a law enforcement officer. And that probably satisfied some of that internal desire for power and control. And then to be able to kind of hide behind the badge and go out and commit these atrocious crimes. He's living kind of a duplicitous type of life, but in both sides, it's power and control, either over private citizens as a law enforcement officer or over his victims when he's the East Area rapist.
You talked about him having a lot of guns and the potential for, him to react violently had you, approached the door or tried to talk to him. Is it true that after, I guess, in some ways it may be hard to know this, but, he was active over that 10-year period in the 70s and 80s, and then he seems like he's just kind of settled down for this quiet life in this suburb. Is that typical from what, or are there questions about whether, he could have continued in some way?
There's most certainly questions about whether or not he has other crimes. We know his last crime, the last crime that we know of is May 5th, 1986, down in Irvine. Absolutely could have other crimes after that we don't know about at this point in time. I do think that if he does, probably few. He is older than what most people thought. Most people thought he was a much younger man at the time of mid-1976, 18 to 20 years old. He actually, in 1976, when he starts up, the East Area Rapist series starts off in Sacramento, he's 31. So in that last case that we know of, he's 41 years old. Now that's old for a serial predator. Of course, we know of serial predators that continue to commit crimes after that age, but that's generally an age in which you start to see a slowdown. So that's where I think, now that we know he's an older gentleman at that point in time, and I probably shouldn't use the term gentleman when describing him, you know what I mean? But an older man at that point in time, I think he is slowing down. And I also think there are some factors in some of the previous cases that may have scared him a bit, and he was like, I don't want to get hurt or caught, and so he also kind of pulled away.
Okay, all right. Is there anything more that you can reveal about the DNA or the items that you guys were able to pull from the scene that helped crack that?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about exactly how did we, get to him. And we've been somewhat vague in the initial interviews. At this point in time, in terms of how we actually went about and did that, I initiated a process, and it got tremendous help from FBI, Orange County, as well as SAC DA's office with this process, in which we took a look at what can we determine from the offender's DNA to find, if we can't find him, can we find somebody related to him, and then work our way back to him. And so ultimately that's what we did, is we were able to get a DNA profile that we could upload in an open source database, and then using just traditional genealogy, kind of build out a tree, and then evaluate people within that tree against the known characteristics of the offender. And at that point, we used just traditional crime analytics as well as investigative efforts to narrow down the potential pool of individuals and start evaluating those individuals as to whether or not they have enough of the criteria to warrant the man-intensive resources and the costs of doing DNA.
Did it connect him, or did the DNA sample connect him to distant family members, more immediate family members?
Very distant family member, and I wouldn't even say family. These people don't know each other. They don't even know each other exist. But we can utilize the paper trail to show the connection, and then eventually we have to go out and do traditional DNA testing to verify if this person is the right guy. And that's what we did with D'Angelo. That's where we ended up with the 2 surreptitious samples that SAC Sheriff's Office collected.
And as far as the samples, are we talking about picking through trash, or
That is an example. You know, as long as it's discarded in a public location, we can lawfully collect that sample and test it and compare it to our crime scene sample. And if it's a match, now we have probable cause to pursue other action.